I wanted to speak to you a little bit about the church. When you got up this morning, you were thinking about coming here. Did you have a picture in your mind's eye about the place? Could you see the building, the structure, the steeple, the grounds, the parking lot? That's not the church I want to talk about today. I don't want to talk about the physical church. I want to talk about the spiritual church. And I want to center this talk around the foundation. I want to talk about what it's built on. So I brought all these props, a lot of the things that I use every day in construction. But I want to tell you a story, and it's Jesus' story. He told this story, and I remember this from being a little kid. It was probably one of the first sermons that ever sunk in, and it was a story about building. I was sitting there listening to, I think it was my uncle, and he was talking about somebody that was a wise builder and a foolish builder, and I don't know why. My dad was a carpenter, but that made me think, I wonder what kind of a builder he's going to talk about. Is my dad one of those? This is Jesus, Matthew 7. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on a rock. And the rain fell, and the flood came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell and the floods came, the winds blew, slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. A little bit later in Matthew, be about chapter 16, something else Jesus said. He's talking to his disciples. He said, "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." There's several points that we can quickly gather from just a couple of readings. Christ was to be the builder, and he said that, "I will build." The church of Christ belongs to Christ. It is of Christ. He said, "I'll build my church." It's owned by him, right? He possesses it. He built it, and he said he'll build his church. Sometimes I sort of go past things too fast. He used a word that was singular. He didn't say, "I'll build my churches," but one church. In a previous study, I think it was one night not long ago, Brother Bill, we were getting started in the book of Acts. I believe he was in chapter 2, and he told us there when the church started, day of Pentecost, in about AD 33. Want us to consider something that Jesus said, and we continue reading in Matthew 16. He was talking to Peter, and he said, "Thou art Peter," and that word for that name is Petros, and the meaning of that name that he gave him was he is a little stone. Peter, you're a little rock. And then he goes on to say, "And upon this rock," he used a different word. This different word, and this next meaning is a word very similar to the first one of Petros. The new word that he uses is Petra. And what the meaning of that word is a large boulder. I'm going to build my church upon a big rock. Jesus didn't say he'd build his church on Peter. He said he would build it upon the rock. Then I want to look at something that the Apostle Paul wrote, and this is going to be 1 Corinthians 3, and it'd be verse 11. He told them, "After all, no one can lay any other foundation than the one that is already laid, and that foundation is Jesus Christ." No copycats. Not going to be accepted. There's one, there was an original, only one acceptable. He goes on to say in another one, this is one of my favorite, talking about the foundation, what the church is built on. This is Ephesians 2, verse 20. "Also being built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone." So I like that he brought the apostles and the prophets into this. And you remember what Jesus did before he left? He gave the keys to the kingdom, to the apostles. So it's right that Paul would mention this, that the church is built upon the apostles and the prophets, and Christ Jesus is the cornerstone. Church of Christ said that Christ said he would build in Matthew 16. It was established by the apostles not long after Jesus' resurrection from the dead. When Peter and the apostles preached about that death and the raising of Christ on Pentecost, you remember a large crowd was there and they were stirred. The burial and the raising of Jesus, it touched them. The preaching then, the message, it convinced some 3,000 men, and there were women there, and they were baptized for the remission of sins. Thus began the church. That's where it had its beginning. We studied Acts chapter 4 not very long ago. I think I was the one doing that lesson. And we kind of passed over briefly. I intentionally didn't say a lot about it because I was holding that for today. But a part of it had to do with the Sanhedrin. You remember those guys? The word Sanhedrin means council. And that's what they did. They're referred to in the New Testament as the great lawgiver. That was their job. To describe them, there was 71 members, and the rulers and the elders and the scribes. These guys were the supreme court, if you will, of the Jews. It didn't get any higher than these guys. If there was a problem, this is who they took it to. The high priests, those were the ones, they had an acting high priest in their group. They had former high priests, and they also had chief priestly families. Some of their family members are mentioned in Acts chapter 4. There were the elders, and the elders were tribal and family heads. There were the scribes, these guys. They were the legal professionals. Some of them were Pharisees. The majority were Sadducees that made up this council, this Supreme Court, but some were Pharisees. You remember that they didn't have anything in common with each other but one thing. You remember what that was? They each hated Jesus. They hated him equally. They each wanted to kill Jesus. They represented the Jewish upper class and the high priest. They made their peace with the political rulers, and they obtained their positions with wealth and influence. Upper crust. These were the top of the top. Their authority was far-reaching, and it involved several things. It involved legislative, administration, and justice. These guys did it all. Theirs was over the religious, civil, and criminal jurisdiction. If I could make a comparison, these guys were more powerful than Judge Judy. During the time of Jesus, there was one thing they couldn't do. They didn't have the power any longer, now they're under Roman rule, to carry out capital punishment. So that's why they couldn't put Jesus to death. That's why they needed Rome. They needed the government. They took Jesus to the government for their permission or for help. This council met every day. I'm going to a lot of details because we have 20 plus chapters still to go, and this Sanhedrin is going to come up again and again and again with the apostles, and they're dealing with the apostles. So they meet every day, with the exception of they didn't meet on the Sabbath, they didn't meet on feast days. And it's interesting, they had this room that they would go to, that they held their sessions in. But in some cases, there would be times that they didn't go to that special room where the 71 would meet in a semicircle, and that's kind of what happened in Acts chapter 4. They took Peter and John to that place, but sometimes the council would meet at the house of the high priest. 71 people, he must have had a big house. One of the responsibilities was the identification and the confirmation of the Messiah. They're still looking for the Messiah. They don't believe Jesus was the Messiah. One of their jobs is to figure out who is the Messiah. And I can prove that they were looking for him because one time they sent a group and they went and asked John the Baptist if he was the Messiah as one of their jobs. The Sanhedrin accused lawbreakers. They would hold court and they would try to figure out by interviewing the witnesses someone was guilty or someone was innocent. They also took care of temple matters. Anything that was going on that had to do with the temple, criminal matters, they took care of those. And I discovered this one. This was an odd one. They even took care of matters dealing with a corpse. Kind of made me think of the TV show CIS. They're trying to figure out who killed this person. They took care of the trials for adulterous wives, took care of tithes, preparation of the Torah scrolls for the king and the temple. Everything going on. They had a pretty full plate, didn't they? These guys were very, very busy. The Sanhedrin thought of themselves as the builders of Israel. Now we get to this drawing behind me. Heard several of you talking about it being a right angle triangle, and that's right. There was a guy, Pythagoras, and he had this theorem, and he figured out that in a right triangle, I'll read what his theory said, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides. Remember that? You know what that means? That right there, if we multiplied it times itself, 9. Multiplied that times itself, 16. The sum of 9 and 16 would be that times itself. Is that right? Thank you, Pythagoras. Okay, so how's that help us? We're trying to build something. I brought a piece of string. I could start out my wall, I could start here at point A, and I want it to go in a straight line to point B. Where it gets a little dicey is now I want to go at an angle to that. I want to make a right angle. I don't want my building to be going like this or like this. I want it to turn out a square when I'm done with all 4 walls. 3, 4, 5. We could figure that out. I don't have to do that at work. Sometimes I just grab this and I go put it in the corner, and I can lay out a corner pretty much a 90 degree. I'll lay that on my first wall and I start my second wall that way. I don't know what they had in their shop. I don't know what they had for hand tools. But I know that guy was helping them figure out walls. There's something else I want us to think about. It's not just the foundation, but now we're going to start coming up out of the ground. Do we want our sides of our walls straight up and down, or do we care if they lean a bit? I know what I do when I want to figure out if the wall's straight up and down. I'll stick that on there. I don't think they had these little glass tubes filled with liquid with that air bubble in there thousands of years ago. But I know the Bible makes this reference. Plumba. Where's the Bible talk about that? Amos chapter 7, verse 7. Listen to this. Then he showed me another vision. I saw the Lord. Who? I saw the Lord standing beside a wall that had been built using a plumb line. Oh, this was a long time ago. He was using a plumb line to see if the wall was still straight. That's grandpa technology. But it was good enough back then, it's good enough to today. Although actually today, a lot of times I use a laser. I have a lot of tricks that we can use. Sometimes I can even use GPS, and I can use the satellites and figure out where things are. They didn't have that, but what they had worked fine. Revelation, it's interesting what they use for some measuring in Revelation. Chapter 21, 15 and 16, the angel who talked with me had a measuring rod of gold. Oh, check this out. What a job this guy had to do. The angel had to measure the city, its gates, its walls. The city was laid out like a square. It was as long as it was wide. He measured the city with the rod and found out that it was 12,000 stadia. 1,400 miles he measured this wall. That's like from here to San Diego, or it's like from the Mexican border to Canada with a stick, a golden rod. It was as wide and high as it's long. We'll see if this falls, Brother Rick. Okay. The rock didn't knock it down. That's good. So this guy went along and he measured. I think if I sent my guys out to measure something like that, they'd probably take that stick to me. So instead I send them out with something, just go measure this, and let's go out for a long, long ways. And they don't have to bend down. Can you imagine using a rod and measuring from here to San Diego? Back in chapter 4, I'm going to quickly review chapter 4. It starts off in chapter 3. There was a guy that was at the gate, and that guy was lame. Chapter 4, the news of the Peter and John healing this guy. He's no longer lame. He's leaping up. He's getting around great. It had reached the ears of the Sanhedrin, and they apprehended, or they arrested Peter and John. The commander of the temple, called Sagan, was the head of the entire police force of the temple. And it was composed of Levites. The captain of the police force had 400 men, 400 policemen work for him. The captain was considered second in authority only to the high priest. They had a lot of jobs. One of them was to guard the treasury. In the story of the rest of Jesus, these Levite police, they're called underlings, they went about armed with clubs. You remember that? When they went to get Jesus. The priest and captain of the temple arrested the two apostles at the command of the Sadducees. The Sadducees were members of the Sanhedrin group. They rejected most of what was taught. The Sadducees only believed in the first 5 books of the Bible. If it wasn't there, they didn't believe in it. That's why they didn't believe in angels. They don't have angels in the first 5 books. That's why they didn't believe in resurrection. Though they were few in number, they had tremendous influence. These guys were the free thinkers, and yet they were also very skeptical. These individuals are the ones that laid hands on Peter and John. These are the ones that put them in prison, and the next day there's a trial. During this time, many people saw and heard of the miracle that happened in Acts chapter 3. The lame guy is not lame anymore. He's been out there lame for 40 years. Everybody that came in and went out, they saw him multiple times a day. And he's not like he was. He's changed. He's different. A miracle. And through all this teaching and preaching, some 5,000 men, the church has grown. The Sanhedrin is going to take charge. There's the rulers, the elders, and the scribes. These scribes were the rabbis, graduates of school. They were chosen because they had special abilities. These guys were the ones, these were the readers. These were the ones that were the thinkers. These were the ones that were able to interpret the Torah, the law, the Old Testament. These guys would figure stuff out when nobody else could figure it out. They couldn't remember what God had ever said. The Sanhedrin usually assembled in the precincts of the temple. And it was in a hall, and this hall was called a strange name. It was called the Hall of Hewn Stone. They're in a building, and within the temple on the north side, their place was half in the temple, half out of the temple. And check this out. Do you suppose that we could go out to the quarry and find a rock like that one right there? Is there any just laying around you've ever seen? To make it look like that, we had to take some tools. And we had to chip away and chip away. And I'll give thanks to my friend Sammy if he ever sees this on video. If Sammy ever sees this, Sammy made this for me. And Sammy used tools. He used steel tools. And at the end, he was using a steel trowel. But they were not to use steel on the temple. Or iron. They didn't have steel back then. They were not to use iron implements. They were to take rock and they were to fit them in. The mason's job was to fill the wall, but he couldn't make it fit by banging it with iron. If you wanted to knock something off of a corner, I don't know if you pounded a rock on a rock, but that's where they were meeting. And where they were meeting, because it was half outside, their rocks had been squared off with tools. I don't know where that is in the overall teaching of things or your interest in this, but I just found that it was pretty interesting to me. The Sanhedrin, these guys, they had Peter and John set in the middle of them. So they're in a circle or a semicircle around them. And they ask them this question: by what power and what name have you done this miracle? We see the guy. We can't deny that he's no longer lying on the ground. He can't get up. We see that he can jump around. How'd you do this? Where'd you get the power to do this? It's a good question. Peter takes this opportunity to preach the gospel to them. He sets this matter straight by stating the reason that they're being held. We're under arrest. You've held us overnight. And all we did was we did a good deed to a helpless man, verse 9. Peter claims that by the authority of Jesus, the one the Sanhedrin was responsible for murdering, we did this by the power of Jesus, in the name of Jesus, the Son of God, the one that you guys killed. We healed this man. Jesus is the stone which was set at naught of you builders, which was made the head of the corner, verse 11. And this comes from Psalms, the 118th chapter. This is a very strange thing that's taking place right now. Consider what just took place. Something that was predicted way back when. What if something was predicted way back when, and it said in the year 2016, some guy's going to get up with this oddball stone and he's going to have it for a sermon? No, that's not it. But what did take place was it was predicted that the Sanhedrin would reject the cornerstone. The Sanhedrin would reject Jesus, and that's exactly what they did. It took place in their day and time, in their lifetime. The Bible it come true. Can you see that over there, boys? I put his name on there to try to further drive home the point of who they had rejected, who the Bible had predicted long ago would be the cornerstone. And the important thing, in architecturally speaking of the cornerstone, was it could go straight up with the next rock, it could go straight out with the next rock, it could go straight toward you. The most valuable stone in the foundation is the cornerstone. Everything else is built off of it. That's why he's so valuable in the New Testament, and he is what the church is built on. So we're down to talking about the angles, the external angle, the corner, the joiner square. Like I showed you my square, they didn't have a framing square, so the guys were making this, and they had to have something to see, when did we finally have enough off of this rock? When was it finally plumb? This rock was made perfect. Well, I give Sammy extra credit. I don't know if it's really perfect. I didn't even lay my square on it to see if it was really square. Luke adds something that I want us to think about as we're running out of time. I want to give you my final thoughts here. Luke was writing about the same parable, and he adds that Jesus had one more thing to say. Listen to the last thing, quoting from Psalms 118. Jesus said this, "Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust." This is a crushing statement about judgment. If you fall on this stone, this is what's going to happen to you. Huh? I might break the stone or knock my prop over, so I won't crush it. I want you to get a sense of what it'll be like in the final judgment. When people finally realize, oh, now I have to deal with this. After it's too late, I've lived my life, I paid no attention, I was just like the Sanhedrin, I rejected Jesus, didn't want him to be my king, didn't want his influence in my life, him be my cornerstone. And I'll crush myself on him, or he's going to crush me. The preaching of Jesus still has the same effect. Some will get angry, but it'll cause others to believe. So here these guys were. They're in this council. They're in their chambers. They're in that hand-hewn place. They were on trial, but now they've turned the trial around, and now they've put the Sanhedrin on trial. What's the most difficult preaching job you've ever done? Who was the hardest nut you ever had to crack? Did you ever have to preach to your boss? Did you ever think about preaching to your boss? Anybody here ever preached to the governor? Anybody here ever preached to the coach of the football team? How about to your mom or your dad? How about to your husband or your wife? You ever get an opportunity to preach to coworkers? Oh, that'd be a hard group to preach to. Would it be harder than the Sanhedrin? Would it be more difficult than these guys who were the Supreme Court, the rulers of the Jewish kingdom? Nobody ever have it as hard as Peter did and John preaching Jesus to this group of murderers. They rejected him. That's our lesson.
Is your burden heavy as you bear it all alone? Does the road you travel harbor danger yet unknown? Are you growing weary in the struggle of it all? Jesus will help you when on his name you call. He is always there, hearing every prayer, faithful and true. Walking by our side, in his love we hide all the day through. When you get discouraged, just remember what to do. Reach out to Jesus, he's reaching out to you.